The iPhone 12 Pro Max was a big step up for the iPhone. It brought so many new features and changes compared to the iPhone 11 series when it launched back in late 2020. Now that this phone is coming up on 4 years old this November, is the experience still good? To start off, this phone still gets iOS 17, and it will more than likely get iOS 18 as expected from an iPhone of this age. As for speed, it runs pretty well, although there is occasional lag, and there is some keyboard lag on this phone that I've noticed while typing. This phone still feels pretty fast in general in 2024, and I really didn't see any issues with the speed of this device, or even the general performance when watching videos, all that. It's going to outperform a lot of new low-end or mid-range Android phones even, since this was a flagship when it came out, after all. The speed is not something I'd be concerned about in 2024, at least not as much as some other issues that I'll mention later in the video. I'll also note that this phone gets a lot warmer than I'd like while running some tasks, especially in day-to-day usage for whatever reason. The battery life is alright. My unit with 78% battery health can still last decently long, although the battery is pretty significantly degraded. I would say that with a replaced battery, this phone would perform really solid in that regard, and maybe even compete with some of the new iPhones. It is worth noting that this iPhone was known for battery decrease when it came out compared to the iPhone 11 Pro Max. Most of this is due to the inclusion of 5G and the newer design though, which I believe actually shrunk the battery capacity. I've experienced that the iPhone 12 Pro Max has had one of the longest battery runtimes of any phone I've ever used in my life. It did in 2021, and it still holds up really solid to this day. As for the display, this was the last Pro iPhone to include a 60Hz display instead of 120Hz with the 13 Pro. This was also the last iPhone to ship with the older, larger notch cutout. These issues are easy to get used to, but the iPhone 13 Pros improved on both of these aspects, as well as battery, display performance in general with brightness and colors. And if you want to see how the 13 Pro holds up, I have a whole dedicated video using that in 2024 as well. The display on this phone is good though. It's OLED, of course, colors look decent, brightness is acceptable for this phone. These phones actually rarely got burn-in, although sometimes image retention is an issue, or at least was an issue with them. I haven't really seen it on my personal unit, which was pretty heavily used. These phones did have some reliability issues though. I've heard a lot of boards failing on these phones, some of them just due to heat, and some of them due to drop damage actually, as these phones weren't built as solidly as the 13 series and above, as they were somewhat thinner than the 13 Pros, and lighter as well, which is actually a pro in my opinion. I wouldn't worry about this too much though, it's just something to keep in mind as I mentioned earlier. The 12 Pro Max had decent cameras though, talking about the cameras, but personally I never found them all that great. It's got a 2.5 times telephoto zoom lens, which is decent quality, but there's also a 12 megapixel wide angle camera and a 12 megapixel main camera. This was before the 14 Pro where iPhones jumped up to 48 megapixels. The focus distance is good on this phone, although this was really the start of where the iPhone started to get somewhat of a reduced focus distance before the 13 Pro just absolutely axed it. And the general camera is not bad. It's definitely not as good as something like the iPhone 13 Pro. The 12 Pro Max, not the 12 Pro, only the Max, was the first iPhone to introduce the new sensor shift technology, which is basically just a really good optical image stabilization method, which has been adopted by every iPhone since then besides the iPhone SE 3rd generation. I also want to note the camera on this phone is way bigger than the 12 Pros. The camera on this phone is just bigger in general. This phone will actually fit in a 13 Pro Max case. The 12 Pro Max offered a lot of design changes compared to the 11 Pro Max, almost a complete redesign. This phone is larger than the last generation screen size, and this really makes me remember why I don't like big phones. This was the first iPhone to return to the flat side since they switched away from it with the iPhone 6 in 2014. But the sides more or less make this phone really uncomfortable to use. Even comparing it to a normal 12 Pro or something like the new iPhone 15 series, which has slightly curved sides, the 12 Pro Max's screen and general form factor is too big for my preference, and it's also a really heavy phone, being made primarily out of stainless steel, but it is lighter than something like a 13 Pro Max or above. It's also got glass on the front and back, always good to see that. Glass is pretty tough on these, although I have seen a good amount of these break for whatever reason, not sure if they're weaker than other iPhones. I prefer the iPhone 12 mini over this phone, due to most of those reasons alone, just weight and size in general. This was also the first iPhone to introduce the MagSafe charger, which is still being used today, although the charge port found in this phone was still Lightning with USB 2.0 speeds. Still fast charges though, pretty much the same as the 13 Pro Max. I believe it is 20 watts or 18 watts, still pretty good. Overall, this is maybe surprising, but I would actually not recommend this phone to the general user, because these phones generally sell for around $400, which is kind of a lot for what it is. And for that price, the iPhone 13 Pro is such a better phone, with many more improvements compared to the 12 Pro series. This phone was definitely an iPhone to remember, being a pretty notable step up from the 11 series of iPhones, but I just wouldn't be able to recommend it to people anymore. To be clear, it's still a good phone, it's just not really as good as the 13 Pros, and they're around the same price at this point. Overall, I just recommend getting a 13 Pro, better display, better cameras, better phone in general. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, a like would be appreciated, and if you want to see more content like this, you can subscribe. And with all that said, goodbye.